6.7, inverse relations and functions. So when we're talking about inverse kind of means the opposite. So the inverse of adding would be subtracting. The inverse of dividing is multiplying. So it's the opposite. Now when we're talking about the inverse of a function, the opposite of that function would be switching the domain and range. And remember, if you don't remember this, you should write this down. Domain is going to be your x values, and range is going to be your y values. So when you're finding the inverse, it's basically flipping your domain and range, so your x and y. Inverse relationship, we have opposite domain and range. Again, opposite domain and range. So if I give you this relation of r first, and you want to find the inverse, the easiest way to find an inverse is going to be when you're given a chart like this. Because all you have to do is flip your x and y's. So in your relation of r, you have 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, and 1.9 as your domain. That now becomes your range of your inverse, or your y value. A lot of times, it's just flipping your x and y values. So right now I want you to pause the video and try to figure out what would the inverse be of this function. Your inverse of the relation of s, the x value should be negative 1, 0, 2, 3, and the y value should be 0, 2, 3, 4. And they should still match up, so it's just flipping your x and y's. Now if I give you a graph or points on a graph, and you have to draw out what the inverse would be. Again, it's flipping your x and y. So first thing you want to do is figure out what are all the points that are given. So these are all my points given. Remember, the first number is how far left and right did you go. The second number is how far up or down did you go. So when I'm looking at for the inverse, I'm going to write them over on the side. I just flip my x and y. So my first point here would be 3, 4. My second point would be 2, 3, and then 0, 2, and negative 1, 0. So once you find your points, then it's just all about plotting them. So you start at the origin, I go right 3 and up 4. That's my first point. And I go over 2, up 3. I go 0 and then up 2. And negative 1, 0. So this would be my inverse of that function. So when you're given a table or a graph, it's just physically flipping the numbers for x and y. Now we're going to have an equation. So when we have an equation, you should follow these 3 steps, and you should write this down. If math is not easy for you, and you should have a reference, write this down. So the first thing you do is want to switch your x and y. So in this equation, my first step here is instead of writing y first, I write x. And then that's going to be equal to my y squared minus 1. So that's my first step. Switch to x and y. Then you solve for y. So in this equation, I want to add 1 first. Add 1, so I have x plus 1 equal to y squared. And then the opposite of squaring something is taking the square root. And whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So then I would have the square root of x plus 1 is equal to y, because those two will cancel. So this is my second step. And my third step is to write in inverse notation. So this y just means the output. So I'm going to replace y with the inverse function of f. So this negative 1 here, that's saying that this is the inverse function. That's when you flip the x and y. So now my domain and range would be opposite of my original. So this would be my final answer. So right now I want you to pause the video and try to do this problem by yourself. I will be writing up steps 1, 2, and 3. So if you need a little help or want to make sure you're on the right track, make sure to push play and check your work. First step, switch your x and y. So x is going to be equal to 2y plus 8. Second step is to solve for y, so get y all by itself. So you could have it either written like this, or you could have x divided by 2 minus 4 is equal to y. Third step, right in the inverse notation. So the inverse of function of f is going to be equal to whatever equation you had. And if you were wondering how did I get this 4 here, you have to make sure to divide both terms by 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. And that is all I have for you today. Make sure you have a wonderful evening. And if you didn't take notes, go back and please take notes.